Canada just proved it has more power than many believed. A trade fight meant to hurt Canada quickly turned into a problem for American farmers, while Canada showed why its resources are so important. This surprising move made Canada look stronger and left the US dealing with higher farming costs and growing pressure. The Trump administration imposed a 25% tariff on most Canadian imports, and within 72 hours, American farm organizations were filing formal objections with the administration, not about steel, not about aluminum, about potash. Within days, the potash tariff was reduced from 25% to 10% through a separate executive order. The speed of that reversal is the single most revealing data point in the entire Canada-US fertilizer dispute. The administration imposed a full tariff, immediately faced documented agricultural sector blowback, and partially retreated within 1 week. Even at 10%, the cost impact on American farmers is documented, ongoing, and compounding across every planting season since. The US relies on imports for over 90% of its potassium consumption by volume, and more than 80% of those imports come from Canada. That figure has held consistently since 2020. It is not a recent development created by trade policy, and it cannot be reversed by trade policy. The deposits exist where they exist. Saskatchewan holds more than 1 billion tons of potash reserves in potassium oxide equivalent. The United States produced less than 1% of total global potash production in 2023. Those geological facts predate the current trade dispute by millions of years and will outlast it by the same margin. According to the Illinois Production Cost Report, potash prices were sitting around $450 per ton when the tariff threats emerged in early 2025. Full pass-through of the 25% tariff could have increased prices by more than $100 per ton for supplies sourced from Canada. That $100 per ton increase applied across the approximately 5.3 million metric tons of potash American farmers consume annually represents a total annual cost increase approaching $500, $30 million absorbed entirely by American agricultural producers. At the 10% rate that was ultimately implemented, the annual cost increase is smaller but still compounding. Approximately $45 per ton at full pass-through, adding roughly $240 million to American farmers' collective annual fertilizer bill across all potash categories. The structure of American potash dependency is not evenly distributed across all fertilizer categories. Tariffs on imports from Canada, Mexico, and China would have their largest price impacts on potassium fertilizers, given the large reliance on Canadian imports to meet total US consumption. Price impacts would be smaller for nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizers, given a lower reliance on imports relative to total consumption. The United States is a significant domestic producer of nitrogen fertilizer. Domestic ammonia production covers most of the country's nitrogen needs. For phosphorus, virtually all US imports come from Peru and Morocco, not Canada, meaning tariffs on Canadian goods have minimal impact on phosphate fertilizer costs. Potassium is where the exposure is total and inescapable. Over the last 5 years, US potash imports ranged from $2.5 billion in 2020 to over $6 billion in 2022 when prices peaked due to the Ukraine-Russia war. Russia and Belarus are the next largest suppliers of potash to the US, accounting for roughly 15% of imports. The Russia and Belarus alternative is precisely that in theory an alternative, and precisely not that in practice. Belarus's Lukashenko government operates under Western sanctions following the 2020 crackdown on political opposition. Russian commodity exports face complications from the G7 price cap framework and the banking restrictions applied following the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. Neither country can be relied upon by American agricultural importers as a stable, sanctions-compliant replacement for Canadian potash supply at the 80% market share Canada currently holds. The crop dependency on potassium creates the specific mechanism through which potash cost increases translate into food price increases downstream. Potassium is one of the 3 primary macronutrients that commercial crop production requires. Nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium together define the basic fertility requirement that virtually every major American crop depends on to reach commercially viable yields. Corn, soybeans, wheat, cotton, and vegetable crops all require potassium applications calibrated to their specific yield targets. A farmer cannot skip potassium application in a year when potash prices are elevated and expect yields to remain unchanged. Yield declines from nutrient deficiency are well documented and predictable. Farmers either pay the higher price or accept lower yields. And lower yields on the same planted acreage means less supply entering markets for the same production cost, which translates into upward price pressure on the end food products. The Reuters reporting from March 2025 on soaring fertilizer prices documented both American and Canadian farmers facing the same tariff-driven cost environment from different angles. American farmers absorbed higher input costs while simultaneously facing retaliatory Canadian tariffs on American agricultural exports to Canada. A dual exposure that compressed margins on both the input cost side and the revenue side simultaneously. Canadian potash producers, while facing some disruption from the tariff uncertainty, hold the geological advantage that no amount of tariff escalation can eliminate. The ore is in Saskatchewan, the mines are producing, and the alternative buyers in Brazil, India, Europe, and Southeast Asia are available at market prices that do not require any relationship with the American government. In 2023, U.S. imports of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium fertilizer products were valued at more than $10 billion, with more than $5 billion coming from Canada. To provide context, the USDA estimates that U.S. farmers spent a total of $35.8 billion on fertilizers in 2023. A $5 billion annual import relationship representing Canadian fertilizer products alone within a $35.8 billion total fertilizer market describes an exposure that the American agricultural sector cannot restructure on any short timeline. The fertilizer blending facilities, railcar allocations, storage terminals, and application equipment that American corn and soybean producers use are all calibrated around Canadian potash supply. Replacing that supply requires not just finding an alternative producer, but rebuilding the entire physical logistics chain that connects mine to field. The FarmDoc Daily Analysis from the University of Illinois Department of Agricultural and Consumer Economics confirmed that tariffs can also lead to persistent longer-term impacts beyond the direct price increase. Companies may turn to alternative, higher-cost suppliers for inputs typically produced in Canada and Mexico, with those costs likely being at least partially passed on in higher prices. The search for alternative suppliers itself carries transaction costs, qualification, testing, logistics development, and contract negotiation that add to the price impact even before the alternative supply is actually purchased. And in potash specifically, the alternative suppliers at comparable volume and quality to Canadian output do not exist at a price competitive with Saskatchewan production through conventional market channels. The planting calendar is the constraint that makes all of this acutely painful in practice. Potash applications for spring corn and soybean planting in the American Midwest are typically purchased and delivered in the fall of the preceding year or in the early spring weeks before planting windows open. A farmer making potash purchasing decisions in February or March 2025 was doing so against the backdrop of a 25% tariff threat that materialized, was partially reversed, and left a 10% rate in place, all within the same 30-day window during which many farmers were locked into supply contracts for the coming season. The uncertainty itself is an economic cost even before the tariff rate is finalized, because supply contracts signed under uncertainty carry risk premiums that farmers pay through price or availability hedging. Canada's potash dominance is not a temporary market condition created by favorable commodity pricing or policy advantage. Canada is the leading global producer of potash, followed by Russia, China, and Belarus. The U.S. produced less than 1% of global production in 2023. BHP's Jansen mine in Saskatchewan, expected to add approximately 4.35 million metric tons of annual production capacity, will expand Canada's already dominant global position further. American farmers are dependent on a supply source that is simultaneously growing its production capacity, deepening its Asian and South American export relationships, and facing domestic tariff measures that have so far produced no new domestic American mining capacity to compensate.